Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 8. In this chapter, you're going to actually learn about various security models that are out there as well as security architecture. Also, you will learn about the access control. And also, when we talk about some of the standards that are out there, you also get familiar with the accreditation and certifications that are available for you. And at the end, we are actually going to look at some of the information security framework that are out there. And we will also look at some standards like NIST, ITIL, and as well as ISO standards. Okay, so some of the learning objectives, as I mentioned, you will be able to describe the information security blueprint, frameworks, and also different models that are out there. And also you're going to be able to explain why access control is an essential element of the information security management. We will look at the recommended information security management, and then we will talk about how to customize it to meet the need of the organization. Also, you will be able to describe the fundamental element of key information security management practices, as well as looking at the certification and accreditations of U.S. federal information technology systems that are out there. So in the first part, we are going to look at what are these standards. So information security models, they are basically standards that are being used for a reference, or you can actually use them as a comparisons, and they are always being used as a kind of a stepping stone to kind of develop more standards. So basically you can just use it as a point to start and then adopt it as you go on. One way to select the methodology is basically to adopt an existing security management model or set of practices that are out there. Each information security environment is unique, so we need to be able to modify or adopt portions of the framework. So we cannot just say this standard or this framework works for all the organization. So we should be able to customize it to our needs. So as we said, what works well for one company, that doesn't mean that it's going to work for the other company. The communities of interest are accountable for the security of an organization assets of the company, and they should design a working security plan and then implement a management model to be able to execute and maintain that plan in the long term. This can begin with creation or validation of a security framework. Then after you develop that framework, you follow it by an information security blueprint that basically describes the existing controls and identifies any other controls that might be necessary that you need to implement. So a framework, or sometimes we call it a security model, is basically an outline of a more through an organization-specific blueprint. So these documents form the basis of our design. As we said before, we need to have a blueprint, and we can start designing it. So an initial and ongoing implementation of all the security controls will happen based on this blueprint. And that could include policies, setas, and technologies, training and education as well. To generate a usable security blueprint, most organizations, they need to draw and establish security platform models and practices. Another way to create a blueprint is to look at the paths that other companies maybe have taken, and they call it benchmarking. So also by benchmarking, you can follow the recommended practices or some kind of a standard that has been established by the industry. In the second part, we are going to actually talk about access control. Access control regulates the admission of the users into trusted area of the company. both in terms of logical access to the information system as well as physical access to the company's facility. Access control is maintained by means of a collection of policies and programs to carry out those policies, and also technologies that enforces the policies. The general application of access control actually is divided into 4 different processes. One is obtaining the identity of entity requesting access to a logical or maybe physical location, and that's called identification. The second one is confirming the identity of entity that is looking to access a logical or physical area, and that's called authentication. The third one is determining which action an authenticated entity can perform in the physical or logical area is being called authorization access. And the last one, documenting the activities of authorized individual and systems, will be accountability. So these are basically the 4 processes in access control: identification, authentication, authorization, and as well as accountability. For those of you who want to actually work in the field of security, this access control topic is very important. Access control also helps the organization to basically restrict access to information or maybe the information assets. So access control is built on several key principles. So one of these principles is least privilege. So this is the privilege by which members of the organization can access the minimum amount of information for the minimum amount of time necessary to perform their required duties. So least privilege basically presumes a need to know and also implies restricted access to the level required for assigned duties. For instance, if a task requires only reading the data, the user is only going to be given read-only access, which doesn't allow the users to be able to create, manipulate, or delete data. So for example, maybe in a company like the HR manager might only have access to the payroll of the employees, but only read access. So the HR person cannot change somebody's pay maybe. The payroll person might be able to do that. So maybe the HR manager might only have a read access to that employee's payroll. The second type of principle is need to know. This principle limits a user access to only the specific information that's required to perform the current task that is assigned, and not more than that. For instance, if a manager who needs to change a specific employee's payroll is granted access to read and update that data, but is restricted from accessing pay data of other employees. So again, you can only give access to that maybe particular employee or the employees that report to that manager. This principle is most frequently associated with also data classification. Classification of data falls under need to know principles. The third one is separation of duties. This principle requires that significant tasks to be split in a way that more than one individual is responsible for completing the task. For instance, in accounts payable, maybe one person may set up a vendor, another person maybe request the payment to the vendor, and maybe another person may authorize the payment. So you are actually separating the duties. So that is another thing that in the access control that you can do. So now let's look at categories of access control. So there are a number of approaches that are used to categorize the access control methodologies. One of them is directive, employ administrative control such as policy and training that is designed to prescribe each user's behavior in the company. Second one is deterrent, which discourage or deter an incidents. For example, would begin signs that indicate video monitoring, maybe. Preventive, it can help a company avoid an incident. for instance, would be the requirement for strong authentication in the access control. Detective can help or identify an incident or threat when it's occurring, and corrective, it's basically remedies that are kind of mitigating the damage that is done during an incident. For instance, changes to firewall to block the reoccurrence of these type of attacks is a corrective behavior. And then recovery is basically restoring operating condition back to normal. For instance, if you might have a data recovery or backup. And compensating is basically resolving the shortcoming, such as maybe requiring the use of encryption for transmitting the classified data over the unsecured networks. That could be classified as compensating. This table basically shows the example of control categorized by their characteristic, as well as the impact that can have on the operation. For, as we said, for example, for recovery, maybe the management could come up with disaster recovery plan. The operation part of the organization can come up with a disaster recovery procedure, and then basically the technical guys, they can come up with data backup. The corrective category is basically maybe management can do an employee or account termination. Operational, maybe fire suppression systems, and in technical, maybe the corrective method would be forensic procedures. So in the previous example, you saw basically the categories and also based on their operational impact on the organization. So we have three types of operation, as I described before: management, operational, and technical. So the management, they take control that cover security processes that are designed by the strategic planner and integrated into the company's management practices. So they routinely use this by security administrator to design, implement, and monitor other control systems. The second one is operational control that deals with the operational functions of the security that has been integrated into repeatable process of the organization. And the technical control that supports the tactical portion of the security program that can be implemented as a reactive mechanism to deal with immediate need of the organization. So in the previous example, for example, in the technical aspect, when we talk about recovery, maybe the technical guys, they can create data backups in order to do the recovery. Or maybe to do the preventive measure, they can actually create logging systems or care bureaus using that systems. So MAC, or mandatory access control, is required, and it's structured and coordinated within a data classification scheme that rates each collection of information as well as each user in the system. These ratings are often referred to as sensitivity level, or maybe we can call them classification level. When the MACs are implemented, users and data owners, they have limited control over access to the information resources. So basically, different companies, or maybe even also the military, they use a various classification scheme. So data owners, they should classify the information assets for which they are responsible and also review those classification periodically. The military is perhaps the best known user of data classification scheme, and their scheme relies on a more complex 4-level classification scheme in Executive Order 13526 in 2009. And so there are 3 levels of classification data, and then there are unclassified. So the first one is basically top secret data. So that the unauthorized disclosure of which reasonably could be expected to cause exceptionally grave damage to the national security that the original classification authority is able to identify or describe. So basically that's the top secret. Then we have the second kind of a classification to the data is secret. And then the third one is confidential. And then the last one is basically unclassified data. So other organizations that are working outside the national security, they don't need to have this type of a detailed level of classification that is being used by military or federal agency. Also, they might be able to also find it necessary to classify the data to provide protection. So they will have a simple scheme such as public, that's for general public dissemination of the information, for official or maybe internal use only. So it's not for public release, but it's sensitive and it needs to be for internal communication, or confidential or sensitive, which is essential and protected information, and disclosure of which could severely damage the financial well-being or reputation of the company. So they might have these 3 levels of classification when they are using it actually. Maybe some of you, when you want to work for a federal government, federal agencies, or military, you might get a security clearance. So that's basically another data classification scheme, is basically the personnel security clearance. So each user of a company's asset is assigned an authorization level that indicates the highest level of information classification that they might have access to. Many companies, they have developed the roles and corresponding security clearance. So individuals that are assigned in the authorization level correlating with the classification of the information assets. For instance, maybe the role could be information security analyst or chief information officer or data entry clerk. So based on that role, they would have a corresponding security clearances. So in the need to know principle, it doesn't look at this somebody's security clearance. It just looks at if these people, they need to know this information because their jobs requires them to do. So they must have a business related reason that is allowing them to know this information. This actually adds extra requirements to making sure that the confidentiality of information is actually maintained. So now that we have looked at various classification systems and we talked about security clearance, we need to think about how to manage the classified information assets. And managing information assets should include all aspects of its life cycle, from a specification to design to acquisition to implementation to use, recovery, retirement of those documents or data, and destruction. So an information asset, such as a report that has a classified designation, other than unclassified or public, it must be clearly marked on it. So that's why in the U.S. government they use the color coordinated cover sheet to protect the classification information from casual observer. They might have like a cover sheet that says top secret or confidential or something like that. To maintain the confidentiality of classified documents, managers can actually implement a clean desk policy that requires their employee to be able to secure all the information in an appropriate storage container. So at the end of each business day, they need to make sure that they put these information or data or prints or whatever in a classified, in a secure storage container. by the end of the business day. Also, sometimes when you might not need those classified information anymore, or maybe you have so many copies, you need to actually destroy them, but not just dumping it into a garbage, because again, there are some people that are actually looking at the garbage and they might use those information. So rather than just throwing the document in the trash, you need to first maybe shred it or burn it or do something to it, so that those people, they cannot get access to those classified information. So you might think, okay, those bins that are stored on private property, they can be protected from trespasser. But actually in 1998, the Supreme Court ruled that there is no expectation of privacy for those items that are being thrown away in a trash or refuse container. So it's basically your responsibility to actually shred it if you don't want the public to get access to it. Basically, these are the examples of the military data classification cover sheets. There was an incident, I think, in the British Army that I think there was some photographer actually took a photo of a kind of a secure document that the public didn't need to know, and then published it. So it's always important to have this type of cover sheet on the top of those documents. Now let's look at lattice-based access control, a variation on the MAC form of access control, which basically assign users a matrix of authorization for a particular area of access, and incorporating the information asset of subject, such as users and object. So the lattice structure contains subject and objects, as we said. Maybe the subject could be a printer, and then the object could be the particular subject, maybe the object, the particular object could be a printer, and that could refer to as an access control list. So we are going to look at the list, and the row attributes associated with that particular subject is a user, which we refer it as capability table. So we are matching that printer with that user. The next type of control is non-discretionary controls. So in this type of control is determined by the central authority in the company, that can be based on basically roles, which we can call it role-based access control, or it could be based on a specific task, which we can call it task-based control. Role-based controls are tied to the role that a particular user can perform in a company, whereas task-based controls are tied to a particular assignment or responsibility. In the role-based and task-based control, it's kind of easier to maintain the control and restriction if, for example, somebody who is performing the role or task changes all the time. And instead of constantly assigning or revoking the privilege of those people that come and go, the authority or the administrator can actually assign the associated task to the role or a task. So the person assigned to the role or task automatically receives that corresponding access. So the administrator can actually easily remove people that are associated with the role and task. The next one is discretionary access control. So discretionary access controls are implemented as discretion or option of the data users. User can allow general or unrestricted access, or they can allow a specific individual or set of individuals to access the resources. For instance, a user can have a hard drive containing those information that needs to be shared with office workers. So the users can allow a specific individual to access the drive by listing their names in the share control function. Most personal computer operating systems are designed based on this discretionary access control. Now let's look at other forms of access control. The other form of access control is content-dependent access control. So in the content-dependent access control, the access is to a specific set of information can be dependent on basically on its content of it. So for example, the marketing department needs access to the only marketing data. Accounting information might need access to the accounting data and so forth. Constraint user interface is another form of access control. Some systems are basically designed specifically to restrict what the information an individual user can access. So the most common example is basically the ATM's machine, which restrict unauthorized user to simple account queries, transfer, deposit, and withdrawals. Temporal or time-based access control is basically the access to the information is limited by a time of day constraint. A physical example is a time release safe found in most convenience and fast food establishments that are out there. The safe can only be opened during a specific time, even by an authorized user, such as the store manager maybe can only open that. So basically, we have talked about various forms of access control. In the next part of this presentation, we are going to actually look at the security architecture model. Take care for now.